The book of Psalms begins with a choice. Before the tears, before the songs, before the cries of war and prayers in the desert, the first image is a man before two paths. In Psalm chapter 1, the text sets the righteous and the wicked before the listener's eyes. The righteous does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, does not stand in the path of sinners, and does not sit in the seat of scoffers and the He is not presented for singing, winning, or going up to the temple, but standing firm before the Word of God. His delight is in the law of the Lord, and on it he meditates day and night. The image is silent and strong, a tree planted by streams of water with deep roots, leaves that do not wither, and fruit in due season. On the other side, the wicked are like chaff driven by the wind. They have no root, no permanence, and cannot withstand judgment. The first psalm opens the book showing the human life is not neutral. There is a path that stands before God, and there is a path that perishes. Before teaching the people to cry out, the Psalms teaches that life must be guided by the Lord. The prayer that runs through the entire book is born from this root. The man before God choosing whether to follow the word or walk in rebellion. The poetic history moves on to Psalm chapter 2, and the scene changes from individual to global. Now we do not see just one man before two paths. We see nations raging, peoples plotting vain things, kings of the earth rising up, and rulers conspiring against the Lord and His anointed. The rebellion, which in the first psalm appeared in the path of the wicked, now appears on the thrones of the earth. Men want to break God's bonds as if the Lord's rule were a prison. But heaven does not tremble at the agitation of the earth. He who dwells in the heavens laughs. The Lord declares that He has set His king on Zion, His holy hill, His holy hill. The anointed receives the nations as an inheritance and the ends of the earth as a possession. The psalm ends with a warning to kings: be prudent, serve the Lord with fear, rejoice with trembling, and find refuge in the Son. This is one of the most important points in the opening of Psalms. Chapter 2 speaks first within the context of the anointed king in Israel, especially linked to the Davidic hope. But later biblical reading also recognizes in it a messianic direction, pointing to the definitive king raised by God. Thus, from the very beginning, Psalms is not just about the human soul. He also announces that God rules the nations and that His royal promise is at the center of the people's hope. After this grand vision, chapters 3 through 7 come down to earth. The righteous who meditate on the Word and acknowledge God's rule still face enemies, fear, persecution, anguish, and accusations. Posagiations. In Psalm 3, David cries out, surrounded by adversaries. Many say there is no salvation for him in God. But David responds with confidence, the Lord is his shield, his glory, and the one who lifts his head. Even surrounded, he lies down, sleeps, and wakes because the Lord sustains him. In Psalm 4, prayer enters the night. The psalmist cries out in distress, confronts those who love vanity and seek lies, and calls the human heart to fear before God. While many ask who will show them good, he asks that the light of the Lord's face shine upon him. Security does not come from circumstances, but from God's presence. That is why he can say that he lies down and sleeps in peace, for only the Lord makes him dwell in safety. In Psalm 5, morning arrives. The psalmist presents his prayer early, lays his cause before God, and waits. He knows the Lord takes no pleasure in wickedness, that lies cannot stand before him, and that arrogance cannot endure his presence. He also knows he enters the Lord's house by the greatness of divine mercy. The chapter shows the righteous are not sustained by their own strength, but by the grace of the God who hears, guides, and protects those who love His name. In Psalm 6, the voice becomes more fragile. The psalmist is downcast, feeling his body weakened, his soul deeply troubled, and his eyes consumed by sorrow. He does not try to hide the pain. He groans, weeps, and begs for mercy. Here, Psalms begins to show that biblical faith is not a mask of strength. The man of God also endures nights of tears, but within his prayer, trust is reborn. The Lord has heard his plea. The Lord has received his prayer. In Psalm 7, the cry takes the form of a request for justice. David seeks refuge in the Lord from his pursuers and commits his cause to the righteous judge. He does not take vengeance into his own hands. He asks that God judge with righteousness. The final image is serious. The wicked man digs a pit and falls into it. He prepares evil, but his violence returns upon his own head. When the Psalms speak of judgment against enemies, this must be understood with care. The psalmist is not teaching personal vengeance as a path of faith. He is bringing injustice before God. Instead of acting out of hatred, he places his pain, his accusations, and his danger before the Lord, trusting that God knows the truth and judges justly. Then, in Psalm chapter 8, the camera opens up to the heavens. After the enemies, the nights, the tears, and the accusations, the psalmist contemplates the heavens, the work of God's fingers, the moon and the stars that the Lord has set in place. Faced with the greatness of creation, he asks, "What is man, that God is mindful of him, and the Son of Man, that he visits him?" The answer shows the dignity that God is giving to human beings. Man is small before the universe, but he is not forgotten by the Creator. He has been crowned with glory and honor, placed over the works of God's hands, called to exercise dominion over creation. The chapter ends by exalting the name of the Lord throughout all the earth. Thus, chapters 1 through 8 open the book of Psalms like a great spiritual door. The righteous person chooses the path of the Word. The nations rise up, but God establishes his king. The faithful one suffers, prays, cries, and seeks refuge. And by lifting his eyes to heaven, he discovers that his life is small before creation, but precious before the God who rules over all things. After opening the book by showing the way of the righteous, the rebellion of the nations, and the God who rules over all, Psalms begins to lead us into the harsh reality of those who choose to trust the Lord in a world marked by injustice. In Psalms chapters 9 through 24, the righteous one does not appear to be living a faith removed from pain. He is surrounded by enemies. He sees violence growing. He notices the arrogance of the wicked. And at times, he feels as though God is silent. But it is precisely in this place that the book teaches one of its greatest lessons. Anguish can be transformed into prayer. In Psalm chapter 9, the psalmist begins by praising the Lord with all his heart. He recounts the wonders of God, declares that the Lord judges with justice, and affirms that enemies retreat before him. The scene is one of trust in the divine courtroom. God is seated on the throne, judging righteously. Nations may rise, the wicked may act with violence, but the Lord is a refuge for the oppressed, a refuge in times of trouble. The righteous person clings to one truth: God does not forget the cry of the afflicted. But in Psalm 10, the tone shifts. The question arises like an open wound. Why does the Lord seem so far away? Why does he hide in times of trouble? The psalmist describes the wicked in stark detail. He pursues the poor, boasts in his own desires, despises the Lord, and thinks he will never be shaken. His mouth is full of cursing, deceit, and oppression. He lurks like a predator waiting for the innocent to fall into his trap. The text does not soften the wickedness. It shows injustice as it is, calculated, arrogant, and cruel. Yet the prayer does not end in despair. The psalmist cries out, "Arise, O Lord." He asks that God not forget the afflicted, that he break the arm of the wicked and bring justice to the fatherless and oppressed. Faith here does not deny the pain. It calls God into the midst of the pain. The righteous may not understand everything, but they know whom to call upon. From Psalm 11 to Psalm 14, this tension continues. In chapter 11, the psalmist is pressured to flee like a bird to the mountains because the wicked bend their bows and aim at the upright in heart. But he responds with a higher vision. The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. The earth seems unstable. The foundations appear to be destroyed. But God is still watching, examining the children of men. In chapter 12, the psalmist looks at society and laments, the faithful seem to vanish. Men speak falsehood and flattering lips prevail. In this environment of broken words, empty promises, and oppression of the poor, the word of the Lord stands out like refined silver. The contrast is clear. Human speech may be corrupt, but God's word remains pure. In chapter 13, the pain becomes more intimate. The psalmist asks, how long? How long will the Lord forget him? How long will he hide his face? How long will sorrow fill his heart daily? It is one of the most sincere prayers in the book. But in a few movements, the psalm travels from lament to trust. The psalmist still suffers, but he chooses to trust in the Lord's mercy. His heart will rejoice in God's salvation. In chapter 14, the book shows the deepest root of injustice, the human heart, that says there is no God. The text describes a corrupted humanity turned aside, without understanding and without a true search for the Lord. Violence against God's people is born from a life that rejects the fear of the Lord. But even in this scenario, hope remains. From Zion will come the salvation of Israel, and God will restore the fortunes of his people. There is an important point here to understand this block. When the Psalms ask why God seems distant, the text is not denying God's sovereignty. It is giving language to the human experience of faith amidst suffering. The psalmist knows that God reigns, but feels the pressure of injustice. This tension is a central part of the book. God rules, but the righteous still live in a world where evil seems to advance. In Psalm 15, the question changes: who will dwell in the Lord's tabernacle? Who will remain on his holy hill? The answer describes a life of integrity, walking in sincerity, practicing justice, speaking truth in the heart, not slandering, doing no harm to a neighbor, honoring those who fear the Lord, and keeping one's word even at a cost. After showing the corruption of the wicked, the psalm shows the type of person who lives before God. In chapter 16, the prayer becomes deep trust. The psalmist declares that the Lord is his portion and his cup. He does not seek refuge in idols, but in the God who sustains his inheritance. Even in the face of death, he trusts that God will not abandon his soul and will make him know the path of life. The righteous find joy not only in deliverance, but in the presence of the Lord. In chapter 17, David asks God to hear a just cause. He sees himself surrounded by violent enemies, men who prosper in this world, but whose hope is limited to this present life. David, however, ends by looking towards something greater. He desires to behold the face of God in righteousness and to be satisfied when he awakens in his likeness. The prayer moves from persecution and rises to the hope of communion with God. In chapter 18, The psalm expands as a song of deliverance. David celebrates the God who delivered him from all his enemies and from the hands of Saul. The Lord is his rock, fortress, deliverer, shield, and high refuge. The language is grand. The earth shakes, the heavens bow down, God descends to rescue his servant. The psalm shows that the cry of the righteous is not lost in the void. The God who hears also acts, strengthens, sustains, and gives victory. In chapter 19, the gaze turns to creation and the Word. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims the work of his hands. Without an audible voice, creation bears witness. Then the psalmist contemplates the law of the Lord, perfect, faithful, upright, pure, and more desirable than gold. The same God, who reveals himself in the heavens, also guides the heart through his word. The prayer concludes by asking that the words of the mouth and the meditation of the heart be pleasing to the Lord, to the Lord. Chapters 20 and 21 feature prayers associated with the king. In chapter 20, the people pray that the Lord answers the king in times of trouble, sends help from the sanctuary, and grants him victory. Some trust in chariots, others in horses, but God's people call upon the name of the Lord. In chapter 21, the prayer transforms into gratitude for the victory granted. The king rejoices in the Lord's strength, receives blessings, and acknowledges that his stability comes from the mercy of the Most High. Then we arrive at Psalm 22, one of the most profound moments in the entire book. The prayer begins with a cry of abandonment. My God, why have you forsaken me? The righteous one suffers, groans day and night, is despised, mocked, and surrounded by enemies. Those who see him wag their heads and say he should trust in the Lord, since the Lord is to deliver him. The suffering is physical, emotional, and spiritual. He feels poured out like water, his bones out of joint, his strength dried up, and his hands and feet pierced. His garments are divided, and his clothing is cast by lot. But the psalm does not end in abandonment. The plea transforms into praise. The psalmist declares the name of the Lord to his brothers and calls the congregation to worship him. The poor shall eat and be satisfied. All the ends of the earth will remember the Lord, and all the families of the nations will bow down before him. The suffering of the righteous opens up into a universal hope. Chapter 22 is important because it possesses a dual dimension. It begins as a royal lament and a prayer of a righteous person in suffering within the experience of Israel and David. But the New Testament also reads this psalm in light of Christ's suffering, especially on the cross. Therefore, it helps the viewer perceive how many psalms carry a real historical experience while simultaneously pointing toward a greater fulfillment in the history of redemption. After the extreme pain of chapter 22, chapter 23 leads the listener to one of the best-known images in the Bible. The Lord is the psalmist's shepherd. He makes him lie down in green pastures, leads him beside still waters, restores his soul, and guides him in paths of righteousness. Even when the path leads to the valley of the shadow of death, the righteous fear no evil, for the Lord is with them. The rod and the staff are not symbols of oppression, but of care, direction, and protection. The scene moves to a table prepared in the presence of enemies. The head is anointed with oil. The cup overflows, and goodness and mercy follow the righteous all the days of their life. After so many images of persecution, accusation, fear, and injustice, the psalm reveals that God not only judges as king, he also guides as a shepherd. In Psalm 24, the section concludes with a vision of majesty. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world, and all who live therein. The question appears again, Who shall ascend the hill of the Lord? Who shall stand in his holy place? The answer points to clean hands, a pure heart, and a life without deceit. Then the gates are called to lift up their heads. The King of glory is entering. Who is this King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Thus, chapters 9 through 24 show the righteous crying out in a world of injustice. They see the wicked prosper, feel the weight of persecution, ask how long, seek refuge, praise for deliverance, suffer as one, abandoned, rest as a sheep, guided by the shepherd, and end by contemplating the King of glory. Psalms teaches that faith does not ignore pain. It brings pain to God until the cry finds rest, hope, and worship. After showing the righteous crying out in a world of injustice, the book of Psalms leads us into an even deeper region of the soul. The place where David faces not only enemies from the outside, but also guilt, fear, weakness, illness, and the need to be sustained by the mercy of God. In chapters 25 through 41 of Psalms, prayer takes on a very human tone. The psalmist does not appear as someone invincible, always strong, always secure, always above pain. He appears as a man who asks for direction, confesses sin, seeks protection, waits for deliverance, and learns to trust the Lord even when the body weakens and friends disappear. In Psalm 25, David lifts up his soul to the Lord. He asks that God not let him be put to shame and that his enemies not triumph over him. But before asking for victory, he asks for instruction. Show me your ways, teach me your paths, guide me in your truth. The scene is of a man who knows he needs to be led. He doesn't just want to escape his enemies, he wants to walk the right path before God. Therefore he remembers the Lord's mercy. He asks for forgiveness for the sins of his youth and acknowledges that God teaches the way to repentant sinners. In Psalm 26, the prayer takes on the tone of someone who wishes to be examined. David asks the Lord to judge him, to test his heart and his thoughts. He does not want to walk with false men, nor sit with the wicked. His desire is tied to the house of the Lord, to the place where God's glory dwells. After asking for forgiveness in the previous chapter, he now expresses a desire to live with integrity. Psalm shows that true repentance doesn't end just in relief from guilt, but in a desire for a righteous life. In Psalm 27, one of the strongest declarations of this block appears, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?" David speaks of adversaries, armies, and wars, but his confidence is not born from the absence of danger, it is born from the presence of God. He desires one thing above all, to dwell in the house of the Lord, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord, and to meditate in his temple. Even if father and mother abandoned him, the Lord would welcome him. Faith here is shelter, direction, and waiting. Therefore, the psalm ends by calling the soul to wait on the Lord, take courage, and strengthen the heart. In Psalm 28, David cries out for God not to remain silent. He lifts his hands toward the sanctuary and asks not to be counted among the wicked. The prayer begins with supplication but ends in praise. The Lord heard the voice of his pleas. The Lord is his strength and his shield. Trust is reborn because the psalmist understands that God not only hears but also strengthens the heart of those who take refuge in him. In Psalm 29, the scene shifts. The human voice gives way to the voice of the Lord. The psalm summons the heavenly beings to give glory to God, And then the voice of the Lord echoes over the waters, breaks cedars, makes the desert tremble, and dominates the storm. After so many prayers of fragility, the book shows the greatness of the one who sustains the psalmist. The God who hears in the secret place is also the Lord whose voice governs creation. And the same God who sits as king gives strength to his people and blesses them with peace. In Psalm 30, the prayer becomes gratitude for deliverance. David celebrates because the Lord lifted him up and did not allow his enemies to rejoice over him. It speaks of illness, of near death, of crying out, and restoration. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. The psalm does not deny the night. It shows that God can walk through it with his servant. Lament is turned into dancing, sorrow into praise. And the man who almost went down to the grave now sings to the Lord. In Psalm 31, trust is mingled with anguish. David takes refuge in the Lord, commits his spirit into God's hands, and asks for deliverance. But he also describes his body consumed by sadness, his life spent in grief, his bones weakened, his reputation shaken, and his feeling of being forgotten like a dead man. Even so, he declares, "My times are in your hands." This phrase summarizes the psalmist's faith. He does not control his enemies. He does not control the pain. He does not control the reactions of men. But he trusts that his life is in God's hands. In Psalm 32, the theme of guilt returns with force. Blessed is the one whose transgression is forgiven and whose sin is covered. David describes the weight of silence while he kept his sin hidden. His bones grew old. His strength dried up, as in the heat of summer. But when he confessed his transgression, he found forgiveness in the Lord. The scene is spiritual and intense. Hidden guilt dries up the soul. Confession paves the way for mercy. This point is essential to understanding the Psalms. The righteous person is not presented as someone without sin, but as someone who does not flee from God when they sin. David knows guilt, but he also knows the path of confession. The difference between the righteous and the wicked is not that the righteous never fall, it is that the righteous return to God, submit to his truth, and seek his mercy. In Psalm 33, the focus widens once again. The righteous are called to rejoice in the Lord because the word of the Lord is right, his works are faithful, and his counsel stands forever. Kings do not win by the size of their armies. Warriors are not delivered by their own strength. Horses do not guarantee salvation. The eyes of the Lord are on those who fear him and hope in his mercy. David's trust now becomes the trust of all the people. In Psalm 34, David bears witness to deliverance. He blesses the Lord at all times and invites the afflicted to magnify the name of God. He sought the Lord, and the Lord answered him. Those who look to God are radiant, and their faces are never covered with shame. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him. But the psalm also teaches, turn from evil and do good, seek peace and pursue it. The God who delivers also calls his people to live in reverence and righteousness. In Psalm chapter 35, the conflict returns. David asks the Lord to contend with those who contend against him. He was betrayed by people who repaid evil for good. When they were ill, he humbled himself and prayed for them. Now they rise up against him with mockery and violence. The pain here does not come only from distant enemies, but from people who should have acted with justice. Even so, David brings the cause before the Lord and hopes that his tongue will celebrate divine justice. In Psalm chapter 36, the contrast appears once again. Transgression speaks to the heart of the wicked, and there is no fear of God before their eyes. Their words are wickedness and deceit. But in contrast, the Lord's mercy reaches the heavens, his faithfulness to the clouds, and his righteousness is like the mountains of God. Men take refuge in the shadow of his wings, drink from the abundance of his house, and find in him the fountain of life. In Psalm chapter 37, David teaches the righteous not to fret because of evildoers, nor to envy those who practice iniquity. They will soon wither like the grass. The righteous must trust in the Lord, do good, commit their way to God, and rest in Him. This psalm responds with maturity to a great tension in the book. The wicked seem to prosper, but their tenure is fragile. The righteous can wait because the true inheritance is in the hands of the Lord. In Psalm chapter 38, pain returns to the body and the conscience. David feels the weight of discipline. He speaks of wounds, weakness, guilt, and depression. His friends keep away, his enemies set traps, and he places himself before God as one who waits in silence. In chapter 39, this fragility deepens. The psalmist reflects on the brevity of life. His days are but a handbreadth. His existence is like a breath. He realizes that man bustles about, accumulates, and passes away. But his hope is in the Lord. In Psalm chapter 40, the waiting finds an answer. David waited patiently for the Lord, and God inclined to him, heard his cry, lifted him out of a pit of destruction, and set his feet upon a rock. Now there is a new song in his mouth, but the psalm does not end as if all struggles were over. David still asks for help, still acknowledges his poverty and need, but he already knows that the Lord thinks of him. In Psalm 41, the first book of Psalms concludes with themes of compassion, illness, and betrayal. David speaks of the Blessed One who considers the poor, asks the Lord to sustain him on his sickbed, and confesses he has sinned against God again. But he also feels the malice of enemies and the pain of betrayal by a close friend, someone who ate his bread and lifted his heel against him. Even so, he ends by blessing the Lord, the God of Israel, from everlasting to everlasting to everlasting. Thus, chapters 25 to 41 show David's faith in a deeply human way. He asks for guidance, confesses sins, faces enemies, sees refuge, suffers in body, feels the sting of betrayal, learns to wait, and discovers his life depends on the Lord's mercy. Psalms closes its first great block, showing that the man of God is not sustained by his own perfection, but by the God who hears, forgives, guides, and lifts up those who trust him. After ending the first great block with David's deep experience, the book of Psalms shifts tone and broadens the landscape. Now, pain does not appear only in the voice of a persecuted man. It appears as the thirst of a soul that feels distant from God's presence. Psalm 42 begins the second book of Psalms. The opening image is one of the most powerful in the entire collection. As the deer pants for streams of water, so the psalmist's soul longs for God. It is not just religious desire, it is thirst. It is a necessity. It is the soul seeking the living God, while tears become its food day and night. The enemies ask continually, "Where is your God?" And this question weighs on the heart as if the absence of an answer were more painful than the persecution itself. The psalmist remembers walking with the crowds to the house of God amidst voices of joy and praise. The memory of worship, of fellowship, and of presence in the sanctuary deepens the longing. He is not just sad. He feels he has lost the place where his soul found direction. Then, in the midst of his anguish, he talks to himself, "Why are you cast down? O my soul, why are you in turmoil within me? Hope in God, I shall yet praise him." This phrase shows a faith struggling to remain standing. The psalmist does not pretend he is fine. He acknowledges the dejection, but calls his own soul back to hope. Faith here is not the absence of crisis. It is the soul preaching truth to itself when everything seems confusing. In Psalm 43, the prayer continues as if it were an extension of the same cry. The psalmist asks God to vindicate him, deliver him from the deceitful and unjust man, and send his light and truth to guide him. The goal of the prayer is clear: to return to the holy hill, to the altar of God, to the place of worship. He wants to come once again before the God of his joy. The thirst from the previous chapter now transforms into a path. The soul wants to be led back into the presence of the Lord. This point is important because chapters 42 and 43 seem to form a single prayer in motion. The same refrain appears, the same downcast soul speaks, and the same desire to return to God's presence drives the text. This helps us see that the focus of these psalms is not just sadness but longing for the living God and hope for restoration in worship. In Psalm 44, the cry ceases to be merely personal and becomes a collective memory. The people remember what they heard from their fathers. God drove out nations, planted Israel in the land, and gave victory not by human sword but by his powerful arm. The past is full of deliverance, but the present is marked by humiliation. The people feel rejected, given over to enemies, and scattered among the nations. The pain increases because they cannot fully understand the reason for that suffering. The prayer becomes intense. They claim they have not forgotten God nor been unfaithful to his covenant, yet they have still been crushed. The psalm ends by asking God to awake, arise, and redeem his people for the sake of his mercy. It is a scene of a wounded community, looking at history and asking why the God who acted in the past seems distant in the present. In Psalm 45, the scene shifts to a royal wedding song. The psalmist contemplates the king in his beauty, majesty, and justice. It speaks of throne, sword, truth, meekness, and righteousness. The figure of the bride also appears, called to leave her home and enter the king's honor. Within the collection, this psalm functions as a window of royal hope amidst the laments. After the thirsty soul and the humiliated people, the image of the ideal king appears again, linked to justice and blessing. In Psalm 46, one of the firmest declarations in the book appears, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. The earth may shake, the mountains may tremble, the waters may roar, but the people of God need not fear. Need not fear. The image is grand. The world seems to be collapsing, but there is a river that gladdens the city of God. God is in its midst, and it will not be shaken. The psalm looks at nations in turmoil, at kingdoms moving, at wars and threats. But a voice rises above the chaos. Be still and know that I am God. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Here, Psalms teaches the people to see beyond the instability of history. When everything shakes, God remains in the midst of his people. In Psalm 47, the response is praise, praise. All peoples are called to clap their hands and celebrate God with shouts of joy. The Lord is king over all the earth. He does not rule only Israel, he rules the nations. The princes of the peoples gather with the people of the God of Abraham. The hope expands. Israel's worship points to a divine government recognized by the whole earth. In Psalm 48, the focus turns to Zion. The city of God appears beautiful, elevated, the joy of all the earth. Kings gather, come to the city, and are filled with amazement. The people contemplate the towers, the palaces, the walls, but the center of trust is not in the stones, it is in the God who dwells there. The psalm invites the present generation to tell the generation to come that this God is our God forever and ever, and He will be our guide even to death. In Psalm 49, wisdom enters the collection. The psalmist calls to all peoples, rich and poor, great and small, to hear. He speaks about the illusion of riches and the certainty of death. No man can redeem his brother nor give to God the ransom for him. The rich may trust in their wealth, may name lands after themselves, may live surrounded by honor, but they will not remain. Death reaches everyone. The difference lies in God, who can redeem the soul from the power of the grave. This chapter helps balance the message of the block. After speaking of city, king, sanctuary, and security, the psalm reminds us that no earthly stability is absolute. Wealth, power, and honor do not overcome death. True hope is not in human accumulation, but in the God who rescues life and gives eternal meaning to existence. In Psalm 50, God summons heaven and earth as witnesses and calls His people to account. He comes from Zion, perfect in beauty, and He does not keep silent. The problem is not a lack of sacrifices on the altar. The problem is a separate cult of obedience, gratitude, and truth. God declares He does not depend on offered animals, for all the animals of the forest are His, and the cattle on 1,000 hills are there. What He requires is gratitude, faithfulness, and a life that honors Him. The psalm confronts those who speak of the covenant but live in disobedience. They recite God's words but reject His discipline. They participate in religion but use their mouths for deceit and join in evil. So the Lord shows that true worship is not a holy appearance, it is a life placed before Him with sincerity. Whoever offers a sacrifice of praise glorifies God, and whoever orders their way will see the salvation of the Lord. Thus, chapters 42 to 50 show the thirsty soul, the wounded people, the memory of the past, the hope in Zion, the security in the God who reigns, and the call to true worship. Psalms teaches that faith can go through dejection, longing, crisis, and enemy pressure, but it must always return to the same center, the living God, His presence, His word, and a worship that is not empty but born from an obedient heart. After showing the soul thirsting for God and the hope found in the sanctuary, the book of Psalms leads us to one of the deepest regions of spiritual life. The place where sin is confessed, betrayal is felt, persecution continues, but hope ends by looking to a righteous King. In chapters 51 to 72 of Psalms, the text begins with an open wound. In Psalm 51, David does not appear asking for victory against enemies or deliverance from armies. He appears before God with a broken conscience. The psalm is presented as David's confession after his sin involving Bathsheba, when the prophet Nathan came to confront him. The prayer begins without excuses. "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love. Blot out my transgressions, wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin." The camera here is not on the battlefield, but inside the heart. David recognizes that his transgression is always before him. He does not treat sin as a small error, nor does he try to hide the guilt behind his position as king. He knows he needs something only God can do. Create in him a pure heart and renew a right spirit within him. The problem is not just the external consequence of sin, it is the soul staying before the Holy One. So, the psalm shows one of the greatest spiritual lessons in the entire book. God is not pleased only with external sacrifices when the heart remains hardened. The sacrifice pleasing to God is a broken spirit. A broken and contrite heart the Lord does not despise. Restoration begins when man stops running and places himself entirely before divine mercy. This point is essential because Psalms does not present David as a flawless hero.
Yeah.
The book shows that even the man after God's own heart needed to confess sin, be confronted, and seek forgiveness. David's spiritual greatness lies not in never falling, but in returning to God with true repentance and reliance on grace. From Psalm 52, the setting shifts again to the pressure of enemies. The psalmist denounces the mighty man who glories in evil, loves lies, and uses his tongue like a sharp blade. But David does not end by looking at the strength of the wicked. He compares himself to a green olive tree in the house of God, trusting in the Lord's mercy forever. In Psalms 53 to 55, human corruption, violence, and betrayal appear with force. Chapter 53 returns to the vision of the man who says in his heart there is no God, showing a humanity gone astray. In chapter 54, David asks for deliverance in the face of violent men. In chapter 55, the pain becomes even more intimate. It is not just a distant enemy rising against him, but someone close, a companion and friend, someone he walked with in the house of God. Betrayal hurts differently because it comes from where loyalty was expected. Even so, David finds an answer. Cast your burden on the Lord, and He will sustain you. The righteous may be shaken by words, conspiracies, and abandonment, but they are not left without support. The God who forgives sin also sustains the betrayed soul. In Psalms 56 to 60, the Psalms carry an atmosphere of persecution and danger. David speaks of tears collected by God, enemies surrounding him, men twisting his words, and traps set for his steps. In chapter 56, he declares that whenever he's afraid, he will trust in the Lord. In chapter 57, he seeks refuge in the shadow of God's wings until the calamities pass. In chapter 59, enemies prowl like dogs around the city, but David sings of the Lord's strength in the morning. This sequence teaches that biblical trust is not born of a life without threats. It is born in the midst of the threat. The righteous fear, but they transform fear into prayer. They weep but know that God collects their tears. They are surrounded, yet still find shelter in the shadow of the Most High. In Psalms 61 to 68, prayer begins to rise again toward stability, refuge, and public praise. David cries out from the ends of the earth when his heart is faint, asking God to lead him to a rock higher than he. In chapter 62, he declares that his soul waits in silence for God alone, for from him comes his salvation. God is his rock, his fortress, and his refuge. In chapter 63, the thirst for God reappears now in the language of the wilderness. His soul thirsts, his flesh longs, but the presence of the Lord is better than life. In the following chapters, God remains the judge who sees hidden conspiracies, the refuge of those who trust, and the Lord who sustains the earth. Chapter 68 expands the praise. God arises, enemies scatter, the righteous rejoice, and the Lord appears as Father of the fatherless, defender of widows, and the God who settles the lonely in families. In Psalm 69, the pain becomes intense once again. The psalmist feels the waters reaching up to his soul. He is weary from crying out. His throat is parched. His eyes fail from waiting so long for God. He suffers shame, mockery, and rejection because of his zeal for the Lord's house. The prayer blends profound suffering with a desire for deliverance. Soon after, in chapter 70, the cry becomes brief and urgent. Make haste, O God, to deliver me. Psalm 69 must also be read with great care. It arises as the prayer of a righteous person who is persecuted and shamed. Yet several passages were read in the New Testament in light of the suffering of Christ. This shows how Psalms can speak of real pain in David's life and, at the same time, carry words that point to a greater fulfillment in the Messiah. In Psalm 71, the voice is that of someone looking back at a lifetime under God's care. From his youth, the Lord has been his trust. Now, in old age, he asks not to be forsaken. The psalmist desires to proclaim God's strength to the next generation. Faith is not just personal survival, it is a testimony for those who will come after. Then we reach Psalm 72, and the section ends by looking toward the righteous king. The prayer asks God to give the king his judgments and his righteousness to the royal son. This king will judge the people with righteousness, defend the poor, save the children of the needy, and crush the oppressor. His reign will be like rain upon the mown grass, bringing life, peace, and justice. Nations will be blessed in him, and all the earth will be filled with the glory of the Lord. Thus, chapters 51 to 72 lead the viewer from personal confession to the horizon of the kingdom. Sin must be confessed, the soul must be purified, the righteous must be sustained amidst betrayal and persecution. But the ultimate hope is not just in an individual's deliverance. It is in the King who rules with justice, defends the weak, and brings blessing upon all nations. After looking at the righteous king and the hope of a kingdom ruled with integrity, the book of Psalms enters one of the most difficult parts of its journey. Now, faith is not just crying out for help. It is trying to understand why the righteous suffer while the wicked seem to live in safety. Psalm 73 begins the third book of the Psalms, and the first scene is an internal crisis. Asaph looks at the lives of the arrogant and almost stumbles. He sees the wicked prospering, seemingly without pain, without distress, without fear of death, surrounded by strength, pride, and violence. They speak against the heavens, mock, oppress, and yet seem successful. Faced with this, the psalmist feels the weight of a silent question. Was it in vain to keep my heart pure? The crisis is real. He confesses that his feet had almost slipped, but the turning point happens when he enters the sanctuary of God. There, his vision changes. He stops looking only at the present moment and begins to understand the end of the wicked. Their prosperity is fragile, like a dream that vanishes upon waking. Then the psalmist acknowledges his own bitterness, but also discovers that God was still holding his hand. The conclusion emerges as one of the most profound statements in the book. Apart from God, nothing on earth can truly satisfy the soul. This chapter is decisive because it shows that biblical faith can endure deep doubts without abandoning God. Asaph does not resolve his crisis by looking at the wicked with envy, nor by pretending that injustice does not exist. He finds clarity again in the sanctuary, that is, in the presence of God, where he learns to see life from the end and not just the moment. And the poetic story advances to Psalm 74. And now the crisis is no longer just personal. The people look at the destruction of the sanctuary and ask why God has rejected his sheep. The enemy entered the holy place, raised strange signs, burned the sanctuary, and profaned the dwelling place of God's name. The pain is collective. It is not just about a righteous person seeing the wicked prosper. It is about the people seeing the place of worship destroyed. The psalmist asks God to remember his congregation, purchased since ancient times. He recalls that God parted the sea, crushed chaotic forces, brought forth springs, and established day and night. The prayer walks between ruins and memory. The temple seems devastated, but God has been the king from antiquity. In Psalms chapter 75 and 76, the answer begins to appear in the form of judgment and reverence. God declares that he judges uprightly, that he brings one down and exalts another, and that the cup of judgment is in his hand. In chapter 76, God is known in Judah. His name is great in Israel, and he shatters the weapons of war. Even when the powerful seem to dominate, the psalm reminds us that no one stands before the awesome God. In Psalm 77, the crisis returns within the soul. The psalmist cries out at night, stretches out his hands without ceasing, and refuses to be comforted. He remembers God and groans. Then heavy questions arise. Will the Lord reject forever? Has his mercy ceased? Has his promise ended? Has God forgotten to be compassionate? But instead of ending with questions, the psalmist decides to recall the ancient works of the Lord. He looks to the Exodus, to the path through the sea, to the God who led his people like a flock by the hands of Moses and Aaron. In Psalm 78, this memory transforms into a long lesson for the next generation, for the nation. The psalm recalls the history of Israel. Fathers were to tell their children the deeds of the Lord, so that the new generation would place their hope in God. But the text also shows the infidelity of the people. They forgot God's works, provoked the Lord in the wilderness, craved food, doubted his power, and even after judgments and deliverances, they sinned again. Even so, God acted with compassion, remembering that they were flesh, a wind that passes and does not return. The psalm ends by pointing to Judah, Zion, and David, the shepherd, chosen to guide the people. This point helps to understand why the Psalms recount the history of Israel so much. Memory does not appear merely as information about the past. It functions as a spiritual remedy against the crisis. When the present seems confusing, the people are called to recall who God was, what he did, and how his mercy continued even in the face of human infidelity. In Psalms chapters 79 to 83, the national cry intensifies at ease. In chapter 79, nations invade God's inheritance, defile the temple, and leave Jerusalem in ruins. The people ask for forgiveness, deliverance, and justice. In chapter 80, Israel appears as a vine that God brought out of Egypt, planted and made to grow. But now its walls are broken and enemies devour it. The prayer is repeated like a refrain. Restore us, O God. Make your face shine upon us, that we may be saved. In chapter 81, God calls his people to hear his voice. He recalls bringing Israel out of Egypt, but laments that the people did not listen. In chapter 82, God rises among the judges and denounces the injustice of those who should defend the weak, the orphan, the afflicted, and the needy. In chapter 83, the people see themselves surrounded by enemy nations and ask God to act so that all may know that only the Lord is the Most High over all the earth. In Psalm 84, after so much destruction and threat, the longing for God's presence returns with beauty. How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord of hosts! The soul yearns for the courts of the Lord. Even the sparrow finds a home, and the swallow a nest near the altars of God, God. The psalmist declares that one day in the courts of the Lord is better than 1,000 elsewhere. In the midst of crisis, the greatest desire remains to be close to God. In Psalms 85 through 87, requests for restoration and visions of hope appear. The people ask God to revive them again, to show His mercy and grant salvation. Yeah. Righteousness and peace meet, faithfulness springs from the earth, and righteousness looks down from heaven. In chapter 86, David prays as a needy servant, asking for instruction, mercy, and an undivided heart to fear the name of the Lord. In chapter 87, Zion appears again as the beloved city, a place linked to God's plans among the nations among. Then, Psalm 88 takes the listener to one of the darkest prayers in the Bible. The psalmist cries out day and night, feels his soul full of troubles, draws near the grave, and feels abandoned among the dead and surrounded by darkness. Unlike many psalms, this one barely ends with a visible turn of hope. The final image is one of darkness. Chapter 88 is difficult because it seems to end without relief, but its presence in Psalms teaches something profound, true. Even a prayer that finds no immediate answer can still be brought to God. The Bible does not censor the extreme pain of the righteous. It turns it into prayer before the Lord, showing that God also receives the cry of those who can only see darkness. In Psalm 89, the third book ends with dramatic tension. The psalmist begins by exalting the mercies of the Lord and His faithfulness. He recalls the covenant made with David. His offspring would be established. His throne would endure. God is presented as powerful, faithful, ruler of the seas, and incomparable in the heavens. But after recalling the promise, the psalm faces the crisis. The king seems rejected. The crown has been profaned, the walls torn down. The enemies rejoiced. The final question is painful. How long, Lord? Where are the ancient mercies promised to David? The book does not hide the tension. The promise remains in memory, but reality seems to contradict it. The human throne seems shaken, and the people must learn to wait when the covenant seems covered in ruins. Thus, chapters 73 through 89 show faith going through its deepest crisis so far. The righteous see the wicked prosper, the people see the sanctuary destroyed, void. Israel's memory reveals sin and mercy. Prayer descends into darkness, and the Davidic promise seems to tremble. But precisely at this point, the book prepares for a great turning point. When the earthly throne seems to fall, Psalms begins to proclaim with even more force that the Lord continues to reign. After the painful question about the promise made to David, the book of Psalms directs the gaze to a truth older than any human throne. Before kings, before the monarchy, before Jerusalem was the political center of Israel, the Lord was already the refuge of His people. In Psalm chapter 90, the fourth book of Psalms begins, and the voice attributed to Moses repositions all of Israel's hope. The psalm does not begin by speaking of palaces, armies, or royal successors. It begins by saying that the Lord has been the refuge of His people from generation to generation. Before the mountains were born, before the earth and world were formed, God was already God from eternity to eternity. The scene is marked by the contrast between God's eternity and human fragility. Man returns to dust. 1,000 years before God are like yesterday when it is past, like a watch in the night. Human life is compared to grass that flourishes in the morning and withers by the evening. Moses looks at the brevity of existence and asks for wisdom. Teach us to number our days so that we may gain a heart of wisdom. After the crisis over the fall of the throne, Psalms begins by remembering that human life is fragile, but God remains and guides. In Psalm chapter 91, fragility finds shelter. He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High rests in the shadow of the Almighty. The psalmist speaks of snares, pestilence, night terrors, arrows that fly by day, and dangers that surround the path. But the central image is protection. God is a refuge, a fortress, a shelter under his wings. The righteous are not outside of a dangerous world. They are kept in the presence of the God who hears, delivers, and sustains. This chapter needs to be understood with balance. It does not teach that God's servant will never face pain, sickness, or danger. The very book of Psalms has already shown the righteous suffering, weeping, and being persecuted. The point is that even amidst the real dangers of life, God continues to be a refuge, presence, and salvation for those who cling to him. In Psalm chapter 92, the tone becomes praise. It is good to give thanks to the Lord and sing praises to his name. The righteous flourish like the palm tree, grow like a cedar in Lebanon, and even in old age still bear fruit. While the wicked spring up like grass, only to soon perish, the Lord remains exalted forever. The stability of the righteous comes not from their own strength, but from being planted in the house of the Lord in the house. Then from Psalms chapters 93 to 99, the book responds to the previous crisis with a repeated proclamation, the Lord reigns. In chapter 93, God is clothed with majesty. The world is established. This throne has existed since antiquity. And even when the waters lift up their voice, the Lord on high is mightier than the crashing of the seas. In chapter 94, this reign is invoked as justice. The psalmist cries out to the God of vengeance to rise up and judge the earth. The wicked crush the people, afflict the widow, the stranger, and the orphan, and even say that the Lord does not see. But the psalm responds, "Shall he who formed the ear not hear, not hear? Shall he who made the eye not see?" The God who reigns also corrects, teaches, and does not abandon his inheritance. In chapter 95, the people are called to sing to the Lord, the rock of salvation. He is a great God, a great King above all gods. In his hands are the depths of the earth, the heights of the mountains, the sea, and dry land. But the praise comes accompanied by a warning. The people must not harden their hearts as in the wilderness when Israel tested the Lord and did not enter into his rest because of unbelief. In chapter 96, the whole earth is called to sing a new song. The Lord must be proclaimed among the nations, his glory among all peoples. The idols of the nations are nothing, but the Lord made the heavens. All of creation participates in the expectation. Heavens, earth, sea, fields, and trees rejoice, because the Lord comes to judge the earth with justice. In chapter 97, the reign of God makes the earth glad and the many islands rejoice. Clouds and darkness surround him. Justice and judgment are the foundation of his throne. The mountains melt like wax before the Lord, and those who love God are called to hate evil. In chapter 98, a new song arises once again. For God has done wonders and revealed his salvation before the nations. Rivers clap their hands, mountains sing, and all creation celebrates the righteous judge. In chapter 99, the Lord reigns between the cherubim, and the peoples tremble. He is holy, he loves justice, and he has established righteousness. Moses, Aaron, and Samuel are remembered as men who called upon the Lord and were answered. The God who forgives also disciplines. The psalm ends by calling the people to exalt the Lord and worship him on his holy hill. This sequence is one of the strongest answers in Psalms to the crisis of the mark. David's throne may have seemed shaken, but God's throne was never threatened. The Psalms do not discard the promise made to David, but relocate hope in its deepest foundation. The Lord reigns before, during, and above all human kings. In Psalm chapter 100, the proclamation of the rain turns into a universal invitation. All lands are called to celebrate the Lord with joy, serve with gladness, and come before Him with singing. The people must know that the Lord is God, that it was He who made us and we are His. To enter His gates with gratitude and His courts with praise is to recognize that His goodness, mercy, and faithfulness endure from generation to generation to generation. In Psalm chapter 101, the royal voice appears again, but now in the form of a commitment. The king speaks of mercy and justice, desires to walk in his house with an integral heart, and rejects perversity. After so many psalms declaring that God reigns, this chapter shows that any human leadership must submit to the Lord's holy character. The true king does not rule for himself, he rules under the justice of God. In Psalm chapter 102, the pain returns. The afflicted psalmist pours out his complaint before the Lord. His days vanish like smoke, his bones burn, his heart withers like grass, and he feels as lonely as a bird in the desert. But in the midst of affliction, he looks to Zion and declares that the Lord remains forever. Generations pass. The heavens and the earth grow old like a garment, but God is the same, and His years will never end. In Psalm chapter 103, the heart is called to bless the Lord. David recalls the benefits of God. He forgives iniquities, heals infirmities, redeems life from destruction, and crowns with mercy and compassion. The Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. As a father shows compassion to his children, so the Lord shows compassion to those who fear Him, for He knows our frame and remembers that we are dust. In Psalm 104, mercy gives way to the contemplation of creation. God wraps Himself in light as with a garment, stretches out the heavens, sets the waters, makes springs gush in the valleys, feeds the animals, makes grass grow, and gives man wine, oil, and bread. Everything depends on Him. When God opens His hand, creatures are filled with good things. When He takes away their breath, they return to dust. The entire creation appears sustained by the Lord's generous rule. In Psalms 105 and 106, praise turns into historical memory. Psalm 105 recounts the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, God's providence. In Joseph's story, the descent to Egypt, the signs performed through Moses, and Aaron, the Exodus, the wilderness, and the entry into the promised land. God is faithful to His word, but Psalm 106 shows the other side of the story. The people sinned, forgot the Lord's deeds, grumbled, craved in the wilderness, made the golden calf, despised the pleasant land, and mingled with the nations. Yet God looked upon their distress, heard their cry, and remembered His covenant. The block ends by asking for salvation and gathering from among the nations, so that the people may give thanks to the holy name of the Lord. Thus, Psalms 90 through 106 show that Israel's hope does not die when kings fail, when the people sin, or when history seems unstable. The Lord is a refuge before any throne, King above the nations, Judge of the earth, Creator who sustains everything, and a faithful God who remembers His covenant even in the face of human infidelity. After proclaiming that God reigns above human kings and remains faithful despite the people's infidelity, the book of Psalms enters its final major movement. Now the scene begins with restoration. God gathers the scattered, hears the afflicted, and shows that His mercy still drives history. Psalm 107 begins the fifth book of the Psalms with a direct summons. Give thanks to the Lord, for He is good, for His steadfast love endures forever. The text calls the redeemed of the Lord to speak. These are people rescued from the hand of the enemy, gathered from the lands of the east and west, from the north and south, from the north and south. The image is of a people scattered, weary and lost, but now called to acknowledge that God heard their cry. The psalm portrays different scenes of distress. Some wandered in the desert with no city to dwell in, hungry and thirsty, their souls fainting within them. Then they cried to the Lord, and He delivered them, leading them on a straight path. Others sat in darkness and chains, afflicted because they rebelled against the words of God, Doel. They too cried out, and God broke their chains. Others suffered for their own folly, drawing near to the gates of death. Yet when they cried out, the Lord sent His word and healed them. Others went down to the sea in ships, seeing the works of God in the deep waters. In the midst of the storm they cried out, and He stilled the tempest. This repetition forms the heart of the chapter. Human beings fall into different places, but the God who hears is the same. Desert, prison, sickness, and storm become settings where divine mercy appears. The restored people learn that God does not just reign from afar. He intervenes in the lives of the afflicted and turns dry paths into habitable places. In Psalm 108, the voice of the psalmist rises in confidence. The heart is prepared to sing. The glory of the Lord must be exalted above the heavens, and God's faithfulness reaches to the clouds. But the prayer also asks for victory. The people need help against their adversaries, and the psalmist acknowledges that human help is in vain. In God we shall do valiantly, for it is He who will tread down our enemies. In Psalm 109, the prayer becomes one of the harshest in the book. The psalmist speaks of wicked men, lying, mouths, hatred without cause, and the repayment of evil for good. He feels accused while he prays. The cry asks God to act against injustice and not leave evil unanswered. But in the center of the pain, he continues to present himself as poor and needy, with a heart wounded within him. The final word is not the enemy's strength, but praise to the Lord who stands at the right hand of the poor to save them from those who condemn their soul. This chapter may seem strange due to the harshness of the words against enemies. It is important to remember that these psalms bring injustice to the court of God. The psalmist is not taking vengeance with his own hands, he is handing the cause over to the Lord, asking that the righteous judge deal with evil with integrity. In Psalm 110, the scene shifts to the throne. The Lord says to the psalmist, Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. The psalm presents an exalted king reigning from Zion, surrounded by power and victory. But this king is also called a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Here, royalty and priesthood appear unusually united, pointing to a figure greater than a common ruler. Chapter 110 was later read as a deeply messianic psalm. Within Psalms, it exalts the king chosen by God. In the Christian reading, it points to Christ, the exalted king and eternal priest. This reading helps the viewer see how the hope of the kingdom in Psalms moves toward a greater fulfillment. In chapters 111 and 112 of Psalms, the focus turns to praise and wisdom. Chapter 111 celebrates the works of the Lord, great, faithful, just, and memorable. He provides food for those who fear Him and remembers His covenant. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Shortly after, in chapter 112, appears the portrait of the man who fears the Lord, the man. He delights in the commandments, acts with mercy, lends generously, and fears no bad news. Because his heart is firm, trusting in the Lord. The faithful God shapes a faithful people. From chapter 113 to chapter 118 of Psalms, the book enters a sequence of praises used in Israel's worship. In chapter 113, the servants of the Lord are called to praise the name of God from sunrise to sunset. He is above the nations, but stoops down to look upon the heavens and the earth, lifts the poor from the dust, and makes the barren woman a joyful mother. In chapter 114, the memory of the Exodus appears in vivid imagery. Israel comes out of Egypt. The sea looks and flees. The Jordan turns back. The mountains skip like rams. Creation trembles before the God who delivers his people. In chapter 115, the contrast is against the idols. They have mouths but cannot speak, eyes but cannot see, ears but cannot hear. Israel, however, must trust in the Lord. In chapter 116, the voice is personal. The psalmist loves the Lord because he heard his voice in his pleas. Cords of death encompassed him. Anguish found him, but God delivered his soul from death, his eyes from tears, and his feet from stumbling. In chapter 117, the praise becomes brief and universal. All nations and all peoples are called to praise the Lord because his mercy is great and his faithfulness endures forever. Then, in chapter 118, gratitude becomes a celebration of victory. The psalmist was surrounded, pushed to fall, but the Lord helped him. The stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. This is from the Lord, and it is marvelous in the eyes of his people. The gate of righteousness opens, and the people enter to give thanks. The rejected stone of chapter 118 emerges as an image of reversal. That which was despised becomes central through the action of God. Later, this language will also be applied to the Messiah. Within the progression of Psalms, it shows that God restores, exalts what was rejected, and turns humiliation into a foundation of hope. Then the book reaches Psalm 119, the longest psalm in the collection, and a grand meditation on the Word of God. After so many scenes of crying out, deliverance, exile, restoration, thrones, enemies, and praise, the psalmist pauses on the path of obedience. The Word appears as law, testimonies, precepts, statutes, commandments, judgments, and promises. It is not just sacred text kept on scrolls. It is a lamp for the feet, a light for the path, food for the soul, and direction for those who wish to remain faithful. The psalmist speaks as someone who loves the Word but still lives in struggle. He asks for understanding, desires not to wander, acknowledges his affliction, asks God to revive him, and declares that he has hidden the Word in his heart so as not to sin against the Lord. True restoration does not end just with the people gathered with songs in the temple or with victories over enemies. It must reach the heart, forming a life guided by the teaching of God. Thus, chapters 107 to 119 show the God who rescues the afflicted, gathers the dispersed, and hears those who cry out in the desert, in prison, in sickness, and in the storm. He sustains the poor against their accusers, exalts the chosen king, receives the praise of his people, and transforms the rejected stone into a foundation. But the block ends by showing that a restored life must be led by the Word. Those who have been rescued by the Lord now learn to walk in the way of the Lord. After showing that true restoration comes through the Word of God, the book of Psalms sets the people in motion. Now faith walks. It ascends toward Zion, sings on the way, seeks protection, remembers the covenant, celebrates the house of the Lord, and finally weeps when that same Zion seems too far away. In Psalm 120 begins the sequence known as the songs of ascents or songs of pilgrimage. The first voice is not in celebration, but in affliction. The psalmist cries out to the Lord against lying lips and a deceitful tongue. He lives among people who love war while his soul desires peace. The pilgrimage begins this way, not with someone comfortable, but with someone tired of lies, hostility, and distance. The path to worship is born from the desire to leave an environment of conflict and seek the presence of God once again. In Psalm 121, the pilgrim lifts their eyes to the hills. The question arises on the path, from where will my help come? The answer is immediate. Help comes from the Lord, who made the heavens and the earth. The image is of a real journey with dangers, weariness, and uncertainties, but also of a faith that knows who guards its steps. The Lord does not sleep, He does not slumber. He guards Israel. He guards their coming and going from now and forevermore. In Psalm 122, the journey reaches the joy of the call. I rejoiced when they said to me, "Let us go to the house of the Lord." Their feet are already standing within the gates of Jerusalem. The city appears compact, united, the place where the tribes of the Lord go up. There are the thrones of judgment, the house of David, and the center of Israel's worship. The psalmist prays for the peace of Jerusalem, not just as a political wish, but because the city represents the people's communion with God and the spiritual order of the covenant. In Psalm 123, the eyes are lifted up once again. Now not to the hills, but to the one who dwells in the heavens. As servants look to the hand of their masters, and as a maidservant looks to the hand of her mistress, so the people's eyes wait for the Lord until He has mercy. The people are fed up with contempt and scorn. The pilgrimage, therefore, does not erase humiliation, but teaches the heart to wait for God's mercy. In Psalm 124, the community looks back and acknowledges, if the Lord had not been on our side, our enemies would have swallowed us alive. The waters would have submerged the people. The torrent would have passed over their soul. But the snare was broken, and they escaped like a bird from the trap. The pilgrim's faith is a memory of deliverance. They do not walk to Zion like those who have never suffered. They walk as survivors of mercy. In Psalm 125, the image is firmly established. Those who trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion, which cannot be shaken but remains forever. Just as the mountains surround Jerusalem, the Lord surrounds His people. The visible city helps the people to see an invisible protection. Israel's security is not just in the walls, but in the God who encompasses those who trust in Him. The songs of ascents are not just travel songs, they form a spirituality of pilgrimage. The people go up to Jerusalem, but they also learn as they walk. Learn to cry out, trust, remember, wait, ask for peace, and recognize that God guards every step. The physical ascent also becomes a formation of the soul. In the 126th Psalm, the memory of restoration feels like a dream. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, our mouths were filled with laughter and our tongues with songs. The nations acknowledged the great things the Lord had done for them, but the psalm also asks for a new restoration. Those who sow with tears will reap with joy. The people carry seeds while weeping, but they will return with joy, bringing their sheaves. Biblical hope does not deny tears, it places them in the field of promise. In the 127th Psalm, ordinary life enters into worship. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord guards the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. The psalm shows that home, city, work, rest, and children belong to God's care. The pilgrimage is not separated from family life. It teaches that all human construction depends on the Lord's blessing. In the 128th Psalm, the man who fears the Lord is seen within his home, eating the fruit of his labor, surrounded by family, and receiving blessing from Zion Inohukso. Peace upon Israel also comes through faithfulness in daily life. In chapter 129, the people recall the many afflictions since Israel's youth. Many oppressed them, but they did not prevail. The righteous Lord has cut the cords of the wicked. In the 130th Psalm, the voice comes from the depths. Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. The psalmist knows that if God kept track of iniquities, no one could stand. But with the Lord is forgiveness, that he may be feared. The soul waits for the Lord more than watchmen wait for the morning. Wait for the morning. Israel is called to wait on the Lord, for with him is mercy and abundant redemption. In the 131st Psalm, David speaks with simplicity. His heart is not proud. His eyes are not haughty. He does not concern himself with things too great for him. His soul is like a weaned child with its mother. It is an image of matured rest. After so many struggles, questions, and crises, faith learns to rest without needing to control everything. In the 132nd Psalm, the memory of David returns to the center. The psalm recalls his desire to find a place for the ark, a dwelling for the mighty one of Jacob. It also remembers the Lord's promise. He chose Zion, desired it for his dwelling, and promised blessing, provision, priests clothed in salvation, and the flourishing of David's power. The pilgrimage to Jerusalem is sustained by this memory. God chose to dwell in the midst of his people. In Psalm 133, the scene turns into communion. How good and pleasant it is for brothers to live together in unity. Unity is compared to precious oil on Aaron's head and the dew that falls upon the mountains. There, the Lord commands the blessing and life forevermore. In chapter 134, the sequence of the songs of ascent ends with the servants of the Lord blessing the Lord at night in the house of the Lord. The pilgrimage reaches the temple, and the final image is worship. This sequence shows that Zion is not just a geographic place in the poetry of the Psalms. For Israel, Zion represents the place of presence, covenant worship, and hope tied to the reign of God. Therefore, ascending to Zion was more than traveling to a city. It was reaffirming the people's identity before the Lord. In Psalms 135 and 136, praise expands. The people are called to praise the name of the Lord because he chose Jacob and Israel for his own possession. God is exalted as Creator, Lord over the heavens, the earth, the seas, and the depths. He struck Egypt, brought Israel out with a strong hand, defeated kings, and gave an inheritance to his people. In chapter 136, repetition leads to memory, for his mercy endures forever, ever. Creation, Exodus, wilderness, victory, and provision are all remembered under this same truth. Then, in Psalm 137, the scene shifts abruptly. After the ascents to Jerusalem, the songs on the path, and praise to the liberating God, the people appear sitting by the rivers of Babylon. There they weep as they remember Zion. The harps are hung on the willow trees. The oppressors ask for songs of joy. They ask for songs of Zion in a foreign land. But the people's question is painful. How can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? The memory of Jerusalem becomes a wound and an act of resistance. The people do not want to forget Zion, because to forget Zion would be to forget their identity, their worship, and their hope. The psalm ends with harsh language of judgment against Babylon, reflecting the pain of a people wounded by destruction, exile, and the violence suffered. Chapter 137 is difficult because of the intensity of the lament and the request for judgment. It should be read as the prayer of a people traumatized by exile, not as authorization for personal cruelty. This psalm places before God the extreme pain of those who lost their land, temple, and freedom, trusting that the Lord will judge the violence of the nations. Thus, chapters 120 through 137 show faith as a journey. The people emerge from affliction, lift their eyes, go up to Jerusalem, and sing of protection, peace, family, forgiveness, fellowship, and presence, but they also learn there may be moments when the holy city seems distant, harps are left hanging, and the only possible prayer is born from tears. Even so, the memory of Zion keeps the people's hope alive before God. After the tears by the rivers of Babylon, the book of Psalms moves toward its conclusion. Pain still appears, enemies still exist, human frailty is still remembered, but now the book begins to lead everything toward the final word, praise. In Psalms chapters 138 to 145, David's voice returns with gratitude, supplication, and trust. In chapter 138, he gives thanks to the Lord with all his heart and acknowledges that God hears his prayer. Even while walking in the midst of distress, David trusts that the Lord will preserve his life and complete what he has begun. The exalted God does not despise the humble. He leans down to sustain those who trust in him. In Psalm 139, David contemplates the God who knows human beings deeply. The Lord knows when he sits and when he rises. He knows his thoughts, his paths, and his words, even before they reach his mouth, us. There is no place to flee from the presence of God. If he were to ascend to the heavens, God would be there. If he were to descend to the depths, God would also be there. Even in the mother's womb, before his days were formed, the Lord already knew him. This chapter shows that being known by God is not just being watched, it is being seen by the one who also guides, sustains, and calls the heart to the eternal way. That is why David ends by asking, "Search me, know my heart, and lead me in the everlasting way." In Psalms chapters 140 to 143, the prayer returns to a scene of danger. David asks for deliverance from evil men, violent and deceitful men. But he also asks that God guard his own mouth, his steps, and his heart. And faith here does not just seek protection against external enemies. It also desires purity before God. In chapter 142, the voice comes from the cave. David feels alone with no one to care for his soul, yet he still declares that the Lord is his refuge and his portion in the land of the living. In chapter 144, David praises the Lord as his rock and deliverer, but he also acknowledges human frailty. Man is like a breath, his days are like a passing shadow. Even so, he asks for blessing for the people, peace in the streets, strong children, firm families, and prosperity under the care of God. So in Psalm 145, David exalts the kingdom of the Lord. One generation will praise the works of God to another. The Lord is gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, and abounding in mercy. His kingdom is eternal. His dominion endures through all generations. He sustains those who fall, lifts up the bowed down, and opens his hand to satisfy the living. After so many cries, persecutions, and tears, David looks to God's rule and recognizes that the Lord remains faithful. Starting with Psalm 146, the final 5 Psalms begin, all of them marked by hallelujah. The book that began with the righteous meditating on the law now ends by calling everything with breath to praise the Lord. In chapter 146, the people are warned not to trust in princes or in the sons of men, because man passes and his plans perish. Blessed is he whose help is the God of Jacob. The Lord executes justice for the oppressed, gives food to the hungry, sets prisoners free, opens the eyes of the blind, lifts up the bowed down, and reigns forever as he... In chapter 147, God is praised as the one who builds Jerusalem, gathers the outcasts of Israel, heals the brokenhearted, and binds up their wounds. He counts the stars and calls each by name, but he also cares for the wounded and reveals his word to his people. In chapter 148, praise spreads throughout all of creation. Heavens, angels, sun, moon, stars, seas, mountains, trees, animals, kings, people, young and old are called to praise the name of the Lord. In chapter 149, Israel sings a new song, rejoicing in their Creator and their King. Finally, in Psalm 150, the book reaches its final breath. God is to be praised in His sanctuary in the firmament of His power for His mighty acts and according to the excellence of His great. Trumpets, harps, tambourines, stringed instruments, flutes, and cymbals enter the final scene. Everything turns into worship, and the final sentence summarizes the destiny of all creation. Let everything that has breath praise the Lord. Thus, chapters 138 to 150 conclude the Psalms by showing that pain does not have the final word. Guilt does not have the final word. Persecution, exile, and human frailty do not have the final word. The book ends with God reigning, sustaining the downcast, defending the humble, and calling all creation to praise.